you everyone for joining us. My name is Haley Pessner and I serve as a manager in the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. I'll be the host of this keynote presentation with Dr. Craig Swenson. Your microphone will be muted for this presentation, but I encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, please keep your eye on the chat for a link to a helpful session feedback survey. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Haley. Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We hope you've enjoyed your morning session so far, and thank you for joining us for our keynote session. My name is Morgan Johnson, and I lead our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning here at Ashford. I'm truly honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Craig Swenson. This marks the 5th year Dr. Swenson has spoken at TLC, his message always aiming to challenge us to think about new learning and different ways to approach our classrooms, with the desire always of helping our students achieve their educational and professional goals. I know he'd want me to keep formalities brief, but that is no easy task with his more than 30 years of experience teaching and leading in adult-serving universities. During his career in higher education, Dr. Swenson served as Chancellor of Argosy University System and interim president of University of the Rockies. Additionally, he was provost and senior vice president of academic affairs of the University of Phoenix System, and later was provost and vice president of academic affairs at Western Governors University. Dr. Swenson has served higher education associations and bodies in advisory and board roles, including the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, the U.S. Army Education Advisory Committee, and the U.S. Department of Education. He is active as a peer reviewer and accreditation team chair for the Commission on Senior Colleges of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. Please help me welcome our president, Dr. Craig Swenson.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here again. And as Morgan said, this is my 5th year of presenting to the Teaching and Learning Conference, and it's always an honor. And it's always something that jogs me to get going and come back to the reason that I do this in the first place. If you had told me when I first graduated from college that I would find myself in the position I'm in, I would have said you were crazy. And now I think I am crazy because here I am. But it's a privilege to be talking with you about education, and especially to be talking with you about education on Election Day. And so I'd like to depart from what I might normally do in talking about pedagogy and teaching skills, to talk about what a privilege it is to be talking about education on Election Day. And I will say, as I think most of you would agree, this is an election like no other in my memory, at least. Voting is one of the most precious rights, and it's a sacred trust that we share as members of a democracy. And democracy, I think often we take that word for granted and what it means. We are a Republican democracy. There are lots of different meanings to that term, and you can look it up. I won't talk about that here, but I will say again that democracy is fragile. Our democracy is and has been an experiment. And sometimes experiments succeed wildly, and we learn truth from it that doesn't deviate or change. And sometimes experiments fail. It is possible that this great our country embarked in 1776, so we're getting close to 300 years. 250 years. I remember the bicentennial. I'm getting my years mixed up. That happens when you get older. We have been a democracy for a long time, as I said, going on 250 years. In the scope of history, 250 years is a brief moment. It's a moment in time, and there is no guarantee that the rights that we enjoy and that we proclaim as sacred to us will remain intact, and that there is a guarantee of it. I would go back to a time in our history when democracy as we know it and our union was threatened. In his Gettysburg Address, and I will just read a couple of lines of it, but to recall to us what was happening. He said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And we would add men and women, all humans are created equal. And he goes on to say, now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived or so dedicated can long endure. At that point in time, Lincoln knew that our democracy was under threat. We were undergoing a civil war. And there is certainly, and I'm not suggesting anything by this except to say that the acrimony and animus of our social discourse right now suggests that we are at one of those times where democracy, that experiment of democracy, might be tested and is being tested. And this election is probably witness to that test. So we should never take the stability of our way of life for granted. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't change over time, but one of the things we're devoted to as a country is the idea that if human beings are created equal, and this is a democracy, that we should express ourselves and choose our leaders and our form of government. And it's my fervent hope that this election day will prove to, in the end, to be a healing time for our country, whatever the outcome, and that we will be able to preserve this great experiment and see it go on. Now, I wanted to talk about what our founders said, and about the importance of education to the preservation of democracy. And I'm going to read some quotations by some people who, in retrospect, didn't practice what they preached in terms of the equality of human beings. They spoke in a certain time and place, in a social milieu, that today we look back upon and say they, in declaring independence and creating the Constitution, left disenfranchised a large percentage of our citizens because of personal beliefs that we today find very difficult. But I'd like you to focus not on that, not on who they were or may have been, or I'd like you to think about the words that they said in terms of the importance of education in preserving democracy. And keep in mind too, that democracy is not a destination, it is a journey. And that one of the aspects of our democracy is the ability to self-correct. And we have self-corrected, though many of us would say not enough and not quickly enough. We have self-corrected, and we will continue to do so. And I'm absolutely convinced of that if we make good choices. So I'd like to start by reading a couple of statements from Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is one of those people of whom I spoke just a moment ago, but was a brilliant man, a polymath, certainly cultured and literate. He said, and I'll read a couple of quotations from Jefferson, "But of all the views of this law, none is more important, none more legitimate than that of rendering the people safe, as they are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty. For this purpose," excuse me, the reading in the first stage, "where they will receive their whole education," and this is back when they were proposing schooling, "where they will receive their whole education is proposed, as it's been said, to be chiefly historical." Now, we don't think of our education today as containing all that much history. In fact, when we think of history, sometimes we think of it in terms of dates and names and the periods of reign the reign of a king or so forth. History was important to Jefferson and the other founders because of their understanding of how the world had developed and how easily despotism can rise. And he said, "History, by apprising them of the past, that will enable them to judge the future. It will avail them of the experience of other times and other nations. It will qualify them as judges of the actions and designs of men. It will enable them to know ambition under every disguise it may assume, and knowing it, to defeat its views." And I think that is pertinent. I'll read another by Jefferson, another two. He says, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." And finally, and this is in a letter to John Adams from Thomas Jefferson. And for those of you who know the history, during the early years of our country, the creation of the First Continental Congress and the creation of the Declaration of Independence, and up to and past the time of the writing of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were very close friends, and they spent a good deal of time traveling, both to Europe and America. We know that when those of you who've seen the musical Hamilton know that when Jefferson returned from Europe, that there was a split in the friendship that lasted for a number of years. But then after about 15 years, they began to write to one another. And Thomas Jefferson wrote this, and there is no little irony in it, but it's still, and I think, an important quotation. "Bigotry is the disease of ignorance, of morbid minds, enthusiasm of the free and the buoyant. Education and free discussions are the antidotes of both. I'd like to read it again. Bigotry is the disease of ignorance, of morbid minds. Enthusiasm of the free and buoyant, and by he meant enthusiasm, he was speaking of irrational enthusiasm for a cause, what Eric Hoffer would later write about in his book, The True Believer, and the nature of mass movements. Education and free discussion are the antidotes of both. Here's another one. This is John Adams, and I particularly like this. He said, "I must study politics and war, that my sons and daughters may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. They ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." And he clearly saw education as the way to progress from just living and making a living to the understanding of beauty. And I think that's always been one of my favorites. I will one or two others very quickly, and I hope you forgive me, but I think this is an appropriate time to remind ourselves about how they felt about education as being absolutely essential to the maintenance and sustaining of our democracy. And this is early on in Lincoln's political life. In fact, this was his first political pronouncement. He said, upon the subject of education, I think he was at the time running for Congress. He said, upon the subject of education, not presuming to dictate any plan or system respecting it, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject with which as a people we can be engaged in. That every man and woman may receive at least a moderate education and thereby be enabled to read the histories, and I again emphasize that, of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions. Appears to be an object of vital importance, even on this account alone, to say nothing of the advantages and satisfaction to be derived from being able to read the scriptures and other works, both of a religious and moral nature, for themselves. For my part, I desire to see the time when education, and by its means, morality, sobriety, enterprise, and industry, shall become much more general than at present, and should be gratified to have it in my power to contribute something to the advancement of any measure which might have a tendency to accelerate that happy period. I'm going to read just a couple of other things because, and it will take me into the next part of this talk today. More than a century ago, the philosopher John Alexander Smith addressed the entering class at Harvard. And he said, "Nothing that you will learn in the course of your studies will be of the slightest possible use to you thereafter, save only this, that if you work hard and intelligently, you should be able to detect when a man is talking rot." And that, in my view, is the main, if not the sole purpose of education, to detect when someone is talking rot. I have been, as I'm sure many of us are, always concerned about understanding the world the way it is. And I mean, that's what scholarship is about. It's what scientific method is about. It's why we study, because we want to be agents in the world. We are by nature information seekers. You look at a little child, a toddler, and they are just bundles of curiosity. They want to touch everything and see everything. All of my children have gone through that period, and those of you who have raised children or been around children a lot know that young children, in addition to having a very tactile sense generally, they go through a period where they want to know why. Why is that? Why? Tell me about that. Why? That curiosity is absolutely critical to our development as human beings. And it explains that the drive that we have and to learn. Curiosity is one of the most important aspects of a successful scholar. People who want to understand why. How does the world work? Why do people behave the way that people do? What happens in social situations and in organizations where power is used and leveraged? Why are things the way that they are? And how did people live in the past? And what can we learn from that? And how does the world work so that we can understand and make better use? And how do you make things and put them together? I have a son, 14-year-old son, who talks about wanting to be an engineer. He likes to make things, and he will take things apart and try and put them back together, and sometimes just take them apart to see how they work, which is wonderful, unless it's something that I would like to put back together. Having that sense of curiosity is absolutely critical to our future, and it's also critical to becoming educated in the way that the founders said that we needed to become educated. It's that innate curiosity and wanting to know why. And the reason is that we need to get that is so that we can make good judgments. Our founders thought that the key to maintaining a democracy was educating people to think critically so that they could make good judgments. Will and Ariel Durant wrote a book that I've read often, and it's called The Lessons of History. And toward the end of the book, they write this: consider education not as the painful accumulation of facts and dates and reigns, nor merely the preparation of the individual to earn his keep in the world, but is the transmission of our mental, moral, technical, and aesthetic heritages fully as possible to as many as possible for the enlargement of human understanding, control, and embellishment in the enjoyment of life. There was a time and I've talked about this before, when when I received my undergraduate degree and I'd had my head down and I wanted to get on with living my life, and so said, I'm out, I'm not going back. And it was a couple of years later that I finally decided, well, I might as well get a master's degree. My employer at the time would help, and I should take advantage of that opportunity. And for me, it was, again, at the beginning at least, a hoop to jump through. But there was a point in my master's degree studies where the light, I always say it was like an epiphany. The light went on in my head. And I said, I love this. I love learning. I want to learn everything I can about everything I can. And that's when my real education started. And that's what I always hope for our students. I know that our students often have jobs, careers, professions in mind. That is the reason that drives them back to school, because they want to take care of themselves and their families and be in a better place. But I always, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's noble. I have the opportunity to meet and speak with many of our graduates, and they are so grateful for that opportunity that they've had that they thought they would never have, or may never have. Earlier on, the time wasn't right. They weren't in a position where they could, and now they are. And I think that's, like I say, that's a noble thing, to want to take care of yourself and your family and make a difference in the world. But what I always hope for them is that at some point that light will go on and they will say, I love learning. I want to learn everything I can about everything I can that will be of use so that I can make good decisions in the world. And so we talk about the institutional learning outcomes that are important to us. And they are pretty basic: the ability to communicate, the explain something, help somebody else understand something, think critically. John Dewey, who wrote Democracy and Education, are you able to hear me? Okay, Morgan?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Swenson.
Okay, good. I had an unstable internet for just a second. I apologize for that. Thank you. We want to learn to think critically. Well, the reason that we need to learn to think critically is so, going back to what I read by John Alexander Smith, you should be able to detect when a man is talking rot. That, in my view, he said, is the main, if not sole, purpose of education. Well, I don't think that's the sole purpose of education. The great Greek philosophers talked about truth, justice, and beauty, and understanding those. We have a problem with truth and understanding what it is. There are some very dystopian novels, Brave New World, for example, by Aldous Huxley, that was written at the beginning of the 1930s. In 1984, by George Orwell, that was written after World War II. And talked about when truth becomes something that has lost its meaning as something. I think most of us think of things that are true or not true, but we live in a time, and it's exacerbated by social media, when we have stuff coming at us from all over the place. It used to be, and I took my first degree where I learned how to write, almost write better was in those news writing classes. But at the time, there were big daily newspapers, and there were the TV networks, and they all had news departments, and they had a very strict code that they would follow to check their facts. And that was important, and to make sure that they got things right. When the internet arrived, there were a lot of people who felt that it was going to be a great boon to democracy, because in the same sense of Gutenberg and the printing press, that books were now available to the general population instead of just to the clergy and to leaders. They felt that having all of that information out there would improve. Well, it has had that. I mean, there are lots of times when, how many times a day do I Google or do another search to find something that I need to know? How to do something on my car that needs to be done, for example. But that dissemination of information also has its dark side. I'm reading a book, and I'll show it. It's by Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West, two professors in the Northwest, who it's called Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. And I'd like to read just one of a couple of quotations very briefly. They said in their foreword, "We have civic motives for wanting to help people spot and refute bullshit," which means, I think everybody knows what that term connotes in this place. It is not a matter of left. People on both sides of the aisle have proven themselves skilled at creating and spreading misinformation. Rather, at the risk of grandiosity, we believe that adequate bullshit detection is essential for the survival of liberal democracy. Democracy has always relied on a critical thinking electorate, but this has never been more important than in the current age of fake news and international interference in the election process by a propaganda disseminated over social media. And then they write, "A democracy is healthiest when voters can see through the bullshit coming from all sides." We just to go back to Lincoln, we are at a time when we will test whether this great experiment of American democracy is going to succeed or fail. If it's going to continue, knowing that it will change over time. But if we're thinking critically and if we're informed voters, then that makes that will make all the difference. Doesn't mean that we all have to think the same thing or believe the same thing, but our education needs to teach us how to spot counterfeits. One of my favorite authors, Neil Postman, who I quote a lot, talked about helping develop our students into being crap detectors, which is the same principle. And he wrote that 30 years ago. So we are at a critical time in our history, a time when education is ever more important. Now, I speak about the importance sometimes of liberal education. I believe in it. A liberal education doesn't mean, is not a political term when it's used. A lot of people misunderstand that. Liberal education just means having a broad, liberal meaning broad understanding of the world and how it works, as I spoke of earlier. And so understanding those things, understanding history, so that, as George Santayana said, we're not fated to repeat those mistakes if we don't learn from them. Understanding geography, so the geography of the world, so we know when we hear about an area of the world, what's happening there and why it might be important for us to know that. Understanding science, understanding psychology, understanding sociology, understanding how our species developed and what is open to us, understanding science so that we can better human life through the belief in science, and an understanding of its limits, to be sure. The last thing I would like to talk about is, how does that liberal education apply to an institution like ours? Ashford's purpose is to serve, generally speaking, working adults. Our students are older. Oftentimes they are working. They have many things going on in their lives. More than 60% have dependents, 25% describe themselves as single parents. They often live in rural areas. They can't take advantage of education the way that we do, and they're older, and so they've been socialized. They're not looking for the socialization that you get in a regular college education for an 18 to 22-year-old on campus, where mom and dad are paying the freight. They're looking for education that is useful and relevant and practical. But I will say, one of the things that we're trying to do, and it's why we've adopted the NACE competencies, and the NACE is the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And NACE has learning outcomes, competencies that are like I described earlier: being able to communicate, being able to think. Those are the adaptable and durable competencies that not only will help someone in their professional life, but will help them in their personal lives. When we tend to think that there or ought to be a separation between educating someone for work, to make a living, and educating them for life, a liberal education. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I believe that every course ought to be a liberal education course, frankly, that we ought to find deeper meanings and broader meanings through that, and to create assignments and give experience that allows students to develop those competencies, but to think more broadly, and to think across disciplines in the things that they're doing and how they might apply that, and give them situated contexts. So, for example, when you're teaching someone to write and they're a business student, teaching them to write better works better if it's a subject that they're interested in. And so you frame that assignment in, it might be to write a business report or a summary to the boss. Or if someone is in a law enforcement program, it might be to write a report of an incident, but to write it in a way that they learn from it. Paulo Freire, the great education scholar, and I quote him often, but he taught the Andean peasants, the peasant farmers in the Andes, to read. And I will tell you that one of the things that people in power don't like is if they want to maintain their power, and if they're in an autocratic system, they don't want people to read and be educated. And so Freire was considered a revolutionary, but Freire taught those farmers to read in the context of their political struggle. It was something that they were interested in and believed in. And so they were more engaged and willing. And I believe that we have an opportunity in institutions like ours to rethink how we bring about education, but most important, and a liberal education, that we mix a liberal education with a practical education. They shouldn't be separate. But of that, most important is the reason for the liberal education and for teaching people to think critically is so that we will make wise decisions. And making wise decisions means making judgments about the kind of information that we receive and take in, and evaluating whether or not it's credible. And so on this day when our democracy is in action, I hope not to have offended anyone, because I don't declare my politics openly. I just want the world to be a better place, and I make no judgments as far as the way someone votes. I would just hope for all of our sake that we do it in a way that is informed and educated, and that we're thinking critically and making judgments about information, so that we're not led into believing things that aren't true. I would be happy if I can, and if not, I've loved being here and doing this, and thank you.
Dr. Swenson, thank you so much. You did cut out just for about 3 seconds. What was your last statement? You would be happy to
Take questions.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
We have I believe it's a faculty member asking if you think a BA in journalism and mass communication is still a very useful degree to obtain. It's one of them.
Well, it was for me, is what I can say. The field of journalism has certainly changed. The standards of journalism have changed. The way that it's disseminated has changed. One of the daily newspapers in the city in which I grew up just announced that it was going to be totally online except for a weekend print edition. I'm assuming a Sunday edition. Things have changed that much, and that newspaper also went to a nonprofit status. Though from that, and whether you study journalism or, I mean, you don't have to have a degree to do journalism, certainly, but I think understanding how the media it uses and it can be effective, and also how we judge the media, I think that's always worthwhile. And so I think whether it's a degree in that or taking courses in it, I think is important.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
We also have a question from Diane Fellows-Morazan, who is a associate faculty in the Center for Excellence. I'm sorry, in the Center for the Enhancement of the First Year Experience.
Mm-hmm.
And she is thanking you for talking about the importance of education, and notes, we live in a time when science is viewed by some as opinion, and the definition of what is a fact is up for grabs. Excuse me. In defending the value of education, formal and informal, we defend our democracy. How can we broach this subject in the classroom and encourage critical thinking without starting a discussion forum riot? The way I've done it, she notes, is to encourage her new undergrads to research a variety of sources and perspectives to create original thought. She asks what others are doing, and I thought perhaps you would want to weigh in on that question about the discussion forum, using the discussion forum to encourage critical thinking.
Well, that's a terrific question, because the purpose. We live in a time, sadly, when conflict is viewed as personal criticism, when it's difficult to make a statement that may disagree without someone taking offense at that. And when you think about, I always think back, and it's probably thinking back to the good old days that never were, because I have sort of a Mr. Chips attitude about education. But those of you who remember Dead Poets Society and the movie with Robin Williams, and he would provoke them, and it feels like we can no longer provoke people in ways that are not inappropriate. And I hope our society can mature to a point where we can do that again, and but not in a civil way, and have real discussions of merit. The one way that I can think of to help people understand how science works is to humanize it. Science, especially right now, seems so far away from many people. They don't understand it. They're frightened by it. Scientists and companies often that support them don't do themselves any favors, because I think we've all had that experience of, you'll have a study come out that says this, and then you'll have a study come out that says just the opposite. And so I think that certainly is a challenge. What I would say, one of the best ways that I found, there's an old sort of cult book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It was one of my favorite books. And when back after I graduated from the university, it's not really about Zen, and it's not about motorcycles, but it's about life. But it's about a father and son who take a motorcycle trip across the country. And it's a book of philosophy. And there is a section in that book where Robert Pirsig, the author, teaches the scientific method. And he teaches the scientific method by teaching how to, he says, start with the problem. Motorcycle won't turn on. I can't get it to kick on. And goes step by step through the process of teaching using the scientific method to solve that problem, and pointing out, for those of you who are researchers, alpha and beta error and all of the things that go on with it. And for me, it was finding something that people could read that was accessible. And I said, oh, okay, I get that now. And that's how you do research and the results of it. And this is how you judge. And that was an important part of learning how to judge. That when you're doing research, you set out to find out whether or not something is right, not to prove that it is right. And I think that was one of those things that I learned from that. And I think just posing good cases and asking people to figure out how, if you had this problem, how would you go about solving it? And, but it's a terrific question. Thank you. And I don't think I did justice to it, and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Dr. Swenson. There is another question from Esther, similarly veined, asking how can we motivate students to engage in self-critical thinking, since many of them believe critical means something negative. You might have addressed that in your last answer, but I just didn't know if there was anything you wanted to add further.
You know, words matter, and the words that we use have connotations, and so I think the being able to say, okay, what is critical thinking all about? It just means taking a hard problem and doing the hard thinking that it will take to understand it. And I think one of the reasons that we link the terms critical thinking and problem solving together is the critical thinking is the process that we go through to solve that problem. And so one of the ways I found is to back into that. You teach problem solving techniques, and there are a number of different ways to do that. And then basically you say, well, there you are. That's critical thinking. I think sometimes critical thinking people, well, there are lots of philosophies of it, but you know, it depends on the purpose. And so I think I gave a talk once on Stephen Brookfield's view about critical thinking and what it means. But those in the on our faculty know that when you talk about critical thinking, we all know what it is, but we can't describe it. So I think that's I hope that helps. I think sometimes you just start with the problem solving and you back into it.
Thank you again, Dr. Swenson. We have a few more moments for a couple of more questions. Kathleen Bates is asking, what is the role of civil disobedience in your thinking?
Oh, that's a wonderful topic, and civil disobedience is time honored. I mean, there was during the Industrial Revolution in England, when there was the machine age, there was a group called the Luddites. And the Luddites, people usually use that term now to mean backward thinkers, and they're pulling they don't want to think about tough things. But actually what the Luddites would do is go and destroy the machinery in the plants. Well, it was a form of social protest because they saw what the Industrial Revolution was doing. It's what Dickens wrote about in all his novels. Mahatma Gandhi was a proponent of civil disobedience, who Martin Luther King learned the concept from. And the basis of civil disobedience is the willingness to protest and to stand up against something that you don't agree with, that's unlawful, that you think is unlawful, and but being fully aware that there may be consequences for your taking that action, and be willing to assume the consequences of making that statement. And I'm a strong believer in the importance of civil disobedience. Think back to for those of us who remember the Vietnam War, those who refused to register for the draft, or even burned flags, or they paid a price for that. But they did it, those that did it out of conscience and were willing to pay the price for having made that decision, and as a way to bring about change. And and that's why Gandhi's hunger strike was effective, for example. So I think civil disobedience is a really important part, and I think was it Emerson or Thoreau who wrote the little sort of the American primer on civil disobedience. All right.
Well, thank you. I think we might have time for one last question. We have a student joining us here today, and she's asking if you, Dr. Swenson, believe online education is as effective as being physically in the classroom.
Yeah, education is education. Abraham Lincoln was what you would call an autodidact, and there are many. He was pretty much self-taught. Doesn't matter how you learn, it matters that you do. I think there are advantages. I mean, I've sat in a 400 student lecture hall before, looking in the back row, looking down at a professor reading from yellow notes. And I will tell you that in that situation, there wasn't a whole lot of learning going on. The other, from teaching for many years, I know that sometimes I would look around the class and there were certain people that were always raising their hand. In an online classroom, you can't hide, and that's a good thing. I was one of those kids in school who would avert my eyes and do anything to be not be called on if I could help it, and especially if I wasn't prepared. And of course, there is a law that says if you're not prepared, that's when you'll get called on. So I really do think that properly organized and structured, that online education is every bit as, and can be every bit as effective as face-to-face education. And you're seeing more online and remote learning opportunities. And I think over time that will increase as technological progress improves.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Swenson. We loved hearing from you. And thank you to the audience for your participation in today's session. We hope you will take a moment to complete the brief feedback survey posted in the chat via the link. And we encourage you to attend the next featured presentation with Bob Dougherty, the Executive Dean for the Forbes School of Business and Technology, and Dr. Iris Lafferty, the Executive Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences at Ashford University. That session will begin at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time today. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.